I know out of the research, and one of the engineers has spoken to me about as well, is this dewatering process as the tunnels go through. It's not just the vibration and things like that, but actually that water leaching out of the soil. And if we live in Narrabeen, which is you've got the sandstone with the clay soil above, and we have cracks opening and closing because of the absorbency of the clay. And what this engineer explained to me is as the water actually leaches out and takes it out fairly permanently for that period of time, that's what causes a lot of this damage to homes. But it's very difficult, as Pauline said, to actually prove that that's what's going on. We're going to have a look at, one of the other aspects we looked at was the potential for contamination in the area. So we're not just looking at what's happening in the air in terms of pollution, but what's happening on the ground. And if my husband would be so kind to try and bring the map back up. It really works when you do it yourself. It's just doing it in this format. As it comes through, I can't see now, but as the tunnels come through this area, we come into an area that used to be an old quarry site. And if you know anything about quarries across Cammeray and Narrabeen, just the natural process of quarrying actually brings a lot of heavy metals to the soil. And we've had residents here actually report that they have contaminated soil in their yard, and I'll talk about a program to investigate that soon. But it also goes through Flat Rock Gully, and we've got an expert for Flat Rock here tonight. So I'd like you to welcome Don. As I said, he's the team leader for the restoration of Flat Rock Gully, and we're going to find out a little bit more about that area. So would you like to come up? You're welcome, Don, please.
Is it possible to go to that map of the baseball field?
Oh, back to Noel's map.
Yeah, the tunnel, baseball field with the gully on the other side. That'd be good.
He's rejecting my map, just.
There we go. Right. Yeah, so that's very good. Okay.
So, would you like to, I know it's not terribly comfy, do you want to sit next to me?
Oh, yes. Sure.
Yeah. So, Don, tell us a little bit about what your job is, and thank you very much for being here tonight, and how long you've been doing it for. Just a quick one.
Well, I'm a bush regenerator, which means I deal with Australian bushland and animals only. The idea of a bush regenerator is to restore native bushland to its natural state with the least amount of disturbance as possible. That's the quote. So I've been involved in this since it was started by the new bushland manager, and he started a training team there in '95, and I joined that training team. It was only going to be for 6 months. 23 years later, I'm still there, and I'm now looking after it myself. I have a small team, and we are actually restoring that whole gully back to bushland with a full complement of birds and animals and what have you as well. And this used to be the pride of the council at one stage.
And sorry, if we could go back to my slides now, please. I believe Flat Rock, and not just Flat Rock, we're talking about the whole area, it's hard to divide it up, has a very proud and long history in terms of Aboriginal culture. You were telling me a little bit about that before. Could you tell us a little bit about what you know about that?
Yeah, indeed, the Cammeray, of course, were there. Their totem animal is the diamond python, which we are very proud to say are in the gully, and I've seen them, and it's just wonderful to be there. I don't know how many sites were along the creek that is now buried under 30 metres of rubbish, but certainly on the Cammeray Bridge, ironically called, which is the suspension bridge, there is a very old cave, we've dated back at least 5,000 years, which sits up on one of the suspensions, the main suspensions holding the whole bridge up. So we do, unfortunately, we've only got whitefella rubbish in there, so we don't have any middens that we can date things from, except that's in that one cave that they had very high above what was Long Bay and is now Tunks Park.
So when we were doing our research, there was a few really interesting books about the area that had dated Aboriginal culture and heritage about 5,000 years in amongst this area. This is a picture of the waterfall at Primrose Park. There used to also be a waterfall in Flat Rock, but it got filled with the next slide. So could we go to the next slide, please? So this is what Flat Rock looked like up until, well, you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, that's awful, isn't it? The tipping started sort of, well, it all began with, I wonder if you've ever heard of Walter Burley Griffin. He put in an incinerator there, which was very nice design, beautiful design, which sort of required what it was going to be used for, which was a sewage outfall first of all, just straight into the creek, down went. And then finally that became an incinerator, and it worked very well indeed. But during the 30s they ran out of money and weren't able, the council, and weren't able to replace one of the ovens. So someone said, oh look, we could bury it, there's a hole over there. And somebody said, well, that's actually Flat Rock Gully. We fix that up, we can do all this. So they put a big box culvert. Now I've got all the photos at the back there showing the waterfall that they buried, the box culvert, and the size of the tip that came in, working on a little cave that sat high up on the western side of the gully where one Henry Lawson, a local chap, used to sleep it off in after various ventures down to the Willoughby or the Crow's Nest Hotel that were nearby. And you can just see how, because that cave right up the top there was 30 metres down to the creek line, and you can just see this rubbish rolling in towards it, to now it sits, the cave, a metre above Bicentennial footpath, and the height of the tip is opposite, which is now an amphitheatre. So we've done something with that. But that whole gully, all filled in there, began in about the 30s with a box culvert straight into Flat Rock Bridge, which sits over the flat rock, which is in Willoughby Road actually. It's a great big ledge, a flat rock, and until they decided to put a stone bridge there, all the wooden ones would just be washed away. But Willoughby Council's first public works was that Flat Rock Bridge over Willoughby Road, which I think was called Flat Rock Road actually, in 1886. That covered everything, went all the way round. The box culvert now sits below the footpath, a Bicentennial pathway, and then turns and goes down into the gully, where there is a second smaller waterfall where it actually comes out. The creek survives and goes out into the open for a little while, until North Sydney decided to fill in Long Bay and make it Tunks Park, and the poor old creek goes under more drains out to the end down there. So, unfortunate.
So you've touched on a few things there, that it's a old tip site. There is a methane vent there, yep, and I can attest to the fact that my father and my next door neighbour dumped asbestos shed down there in the early 80s, sorry about that. But several other people have come forward and said that as well, so there's no doubt that there's some particular nasties under the ground. But on a positive note, let's go to the next slide and see what you worked so hard to create, and tell us how and who was involved in recreating that beautiful nature land that we all enjoy now.
Well, it was the idea. This is the area on the eastern side of Flat Rock Drive. That was the part of the tip that was still there when we got there in '95, and it was to return that back to bushland. Now this was the dream and the idea of the first female mayor of Willoughby, Councillor Eunice Raymond, and this is what she wanted to do. There was plenty of opposition from council. They wanted more sporting fields. Some of those people are still in council, probably having a good old bloody laugh now. But her idea was to put this mounds of bushland, not landscaping, not gardens or anything like this, but mounds that you could walk around, ride around, prams, people, all this sort of thing, some boardwalks, meditation, all this sort of stuff, and we achieved that. It took us about 6-8 years to actually get that going. I guess we've planted something like 16,000 trees and shrubs in the gully side, and then along Bicentennial as well, which is near the Henry's Cave, and around that way. But that was all Eunice's idea, and it was very well received by the locals, of course, and the council, of course, had changed by then, and that was the thing to come and see. A lot of the unis and schools and TAFEs and what have you came down to see how we were transferring a tip, and I'm talking about a rat-infested horror, back to bushland, and then to get the fauna back.
And can you tell us, I believe that there's a lot of native wildlife that actually has returned to the area, even quite recently. Can you tell us about some of the special visitors that you're aware of down there?
Yes, well, wonderfully, 2 years ago, wallabies came back in again. We were so excited about that. The kidneys have been in for about 10 years. Bandicoots came there pretty quickly. Ringtail possums all there. The birds increased from 80 to about 130 different species. Look, we went out of our way to deliberately get the habitats up. Logs and rocks chucked everywhere, you know, the whole thing as bushland as we could. We planted exactly what was there. We took seeds from plants and things in the gully itself and propagated them and brought them up the top and tried to copy what might have been there if it was still a gully. But it was just wonderful. I mean, when we found the wallaby scats, we just couldn't believe it. They at last had got past that golf course, Northridge Golf Course, came round under the Cammeray Bridge, went up high under Cliff Avenue, Calbina, and then up under Sailors Bay Road.
Sorry, is it true that the wallaby on the harbour bridge that was noticed came from Flat Rock?
Yes, it was ours.
It was for tourism Australia.
It went over to see that little patch of bushland that North Sydney says is bushland, and was most upset about that. Got lost on the Cammeray golf course and thought, well, I might go across the road to the gardens. I don't know why they didn't leave it. Anyway,
he doesn't need my microphone, does he? So I'm just conscious of time. So it's amazing what you and hundreds of volunteers and school groups have achieved, and we're all very thankful for it. I think if we go to the next slide, just from a risk point of view, you can see that this is a whole catchment area and the way the water flow down, and as you described, down and out to Middle Harbour. So there's the obvious risks of the asbestos chemical leaching through the tip as things get disturbed, because we're not just going under now, we're going through the tip. We are also connecting that Flat Rock Gully actually connects back up to exactly where the Tarman construction site is going to be. So you've got the double potential for contamination there. And then down out to Middle Harbour. This is also a watercourse through here that has been diverted, as you said. Many watercourses in the area have been diverted, but there's Willoughby Creek. It runs down into this golf course here, and there's actually a dam which actually feeds, and we're talking about drought here, that dam actually feeds a larger number of our sporting fields across the area. That is slated to go, or at least be heavily constructed around, and that risks contamination or a loss of water source. That creek still flows across the golf course. Is actually dispersion for that creek, and it flows down Primrose Park and again out to Middle Harbour. So we've got 2 points of contamination for Middle Harbour. We also have what's been chosen, which we haven't talked about, is across Middle Harbour and the harbour itself. What's been chosen is an immersed tube design. An immersed tube doesn't go under the harbour. Basically, the best way to describe it is going through, so it's laying down tubing on the bottom of the harbour. What that requires is, and I'm racing through to explain, but what that requires is dredging to flatten out and put a surface down. And you can imagine Middle Harbour, if you've been around there's mangroves. Mangroves absorb 6 times the carbon of rainforests, so that's our lungs for our area, and we're putting all this extra pollution in the air. Getting rid of mangroves is not a great idea. It's also the spawning area for fish. So once we start to dredge Middle Harbour, we come up with not just the water quality being interfered with, but given that it's an old quarry site that would have flowed down through Flat Rock to Middle Harbour, the heavy metals, like the likelihood, again we're talking risk, we don't have data, as Pauline said, would be sitting on the floor of Middle Harbour, and once that's disturbed, we have problems with water quality and life of the harbour. And we have children that swim at Northbridge bars and things like that, so that's of great concern for the school community as well. Thank you. I wish we could hear more. There's lots of photos down the back and they're absolutely fantastic. Can you just thank Don for me? Thank